The wind was a blade against Caleb's skin, honed sharp by the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the high plains. Snow, fine as dust, swirled in the grey air, erasing the world behind him and promising nothing ahead but more of the same frozen solitude. His horse, a sturdy roan named Dust, lowered its head against the assault, its breath pluming in crystalline clouds. For 3 days, Caleb had tracked the man named Vance, not for justice, but for the paper bearing his name and a number that would mean a month of hot meals and a solid roof. The trail had grown cold, buried under a fresh layer of white, and now survival had eclipsed the hunt. He saw it then, a smudge of darker grey against the endless white, a derelict mining cabin, its roof sagging like a tired man's shoulders. It was a ghost of a shelter, but it was enough. Inside, the air was still and colder than a tomb. A shattered table and a single 3-legged stool were the only furnishings. With methodical movements born of long practice, Caleb gathered splintered wood from the cabin's own walls, sacrificing a small piece of its integrity for a few hours of life. The fire caught slowly, a reluctant orange flower blooming in the gloom. He settled onto the dirt floor, his back against the rough-hewn logs, the heat a phantom touch on his frozen cheeks. He was chewing on a strip of dried venison when he heard it, a sound so faint it was nearly lost in the fire's crackle. A rustle. Not a rat, not the wind. It came from the darkened corner where a pile of old burlap sacks lay heaped like a burial mound. His hand went to the Colt at his hip, the movement fluid and silent. He rose slowly, every muscle tensed. The firelight threw his shadow, long and menacing, across the small space. He nudged the sacks with the toe of his boot, and the mound shifted, a soft gasp escaping from within. He kicked them away. Huddled beneath were 2 figures, impossibly small and still, their faces pale as bone in the flickering light. They were women, young, their dark hair unbound and matted with dirt. They were identical, 2 impressions of the same delicate face, the same wide, terrified eyes. Each wore a simple, high-collared dress of grey silk, a cheongsam, though he did not know the word, now torn and stained. They clung to each other, a single entity of fear, their shed breath a fragile mist in the frigid air. Caleb stood over them, the cold metal of his gun a stark contrast to the vulnerable warmth of the life trembling at his feet. The wind howled outside, a mournful cry for the lost and the forgotten, and for a long moment, the 3 of them were frozen in a tableau of silent, desperate humanity. He holstered his weapon, the click of the hammer returning to its resting place unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. The women flinched at the sound, their dark eyes tracking his every move. He saw the tremor in their hands, the chattering of their teeth that they fought to control. They were not just cold, they were carved from it, their resilience worn down to a fragile core. Caleb said nothing. Words were a currency he rarely spent, and in this desolate place, they felt worthless. Instead, he returned to the fire, taking the last of his venison from his thil bag and skewering it on a stick. He held it over the flames until it sizzled, the scent of rendered fat filling the cramped space. He then walked back to them and held it out. They stared at the offering, then at his face, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and desperate hunger. One of them, her gaze a fraction bolder than her sister's, reached out with a trembling hand and took the stick. Her fingers brushed his, and her skin was like ice. She broke the meat in 2, giving the larger piece to her twin before taking a small, hesitant bite herself. They ate with a quiet, desperate urgency, their eyes never leaving him. Caleb retreated to his side of the fire, giving them the illusion of space. He pulled his bedroll from his saddle and tossed it toward them. It landed softly on the dirt floor. For the warmth, he said, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse. It was more than he'd said to anyone in a week. The bolder of the 2 gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He watched them as they huddled together under his worn wool blanket, their shared fear a palpable presence in the room. He could see the ghost of Vance in their eyes, the shadow of the cruelty they had fled. The bounty poster had mentioned Vance's operation, a private railroad spur built with labor imported and held by force. These women were its refuse, cast out into the wilderness to die. He had come here seeking a predator, and instead, he had found his prey. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearthstones. Outside, the wind gathered strength, its voice rising to a furious shriek. He was a man who traveled alone, shedding attachments like a snake sheds its skin. But as he watched the two identical faces, their features softened by the firelight and the false security of his presence, he felt the cold weight of a decision settle upon him. Leaving them was a death sentence. Keeping them was a complication he could not afford. Yet, as he stared into the flames, he knew he had already chosen. The world outside dissolved into a screaming vortex of white. The blizzard descended without warning, a solid wall of snow and wind that sealed the small cabin off from existence, turning it into an island in a tempestuous sea. For 3 days, they were prisoners of the storm. The wind clawed at the chinks in the log walls, its moans a constant, mournful chorus. Time blurred into a cycle of feeding the fire, melting snow for water, and a profound, shared silence. Caleb watched them. He learned to distinguish them not by their faces, which remained a perfect, mirrored mystery, but by their movements. He began to think of her as the watcher, moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. Her eyes were always on him, not with fear anymore, but with a keen, assessing intelligence. The other, the tremor, seemed to carry the cold deeper inside her. She startled at every sudden crackle from the fire, every shriek of the wind, and her hands were never still, constantly twisting a loose thread on her worn dress. They spoke to each other in a language that was soft and fluid, a river of sound in the stark silence of the cabin. Their voices were low, intimate, a private world he could not enter. Yet, their actions began to bridge the gap. On the second day, he awoke from a light doze to find them sitting close to the fire, working on his heavy canvas coat. One of them held it steady while the other, with painstaking care, stitched a long tear in the sleeve. They had unraveled threads from the hem of their own Keong Sams, their fine grey silk a delicate reinforcement on the rough, trail-worn fabric. It was an act of such quiet reciprocity that it disarmed him completely. He had given them food and warmth, the bare essentials of survival. They were giving him something more. They were mending not just the cloth, but the fragile space between them. Later that day, the watcher approached him as he stared out a small, ice-crusted crack in the wall. She held out a small, folded piece of paper, salvaged from the pocket of her dress. On it were 2 characters, drawn with charcoal from the fire. She pointed to one, then to herself. Leanne, her voice was soft, yet clear. She then pointed to the other character, and then to her sister, who watched them from the blanket. Caleb looked from the paper to her face. Leanne. He repeated the name in his mind. Then he looked at her sister. Sue. It was the first piece of their identity, a gift offered in the heart of the storm. He gave them his own name in return. Caleb, he said it once, and Leanne nodded, her lips forming the shape of the word silently. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The air was still thick with unspoken histories and a future as uncertain as the weather, but it was no longer freighted with fear. It was something else now, the beginning of a fragile trust, forged in the heart of a shared winter. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was reborn in blinding white. The sun, a pale disk in a crystalline sky, cast long blue shadows across a landscape of profound silence and immaculate snow. The beauty of it was a cruel deception. The cold was now deeper, the air so sharp it felt like breathing powdered glass. They had to move. Vance and his men would not have been idle. The storm that had been their prison was also their shield, and with it gone, they were exposed. Caleb packed his meager supplies, his movements economical and swift. He watched Leanne and Sue prepare themselves, their actions a mirror image of efficiency. They wrapped their feet in strips of burlap he had found, securing the makeshift insulation with more silk thread from their dresses. Their resilience was a quiet, powerful force. He had expected to have to drag them, to urge them on, but they were ready, their faces set with a grim determination that matched his own. The journey was a slow, punishing crawl through a world not meant for men. The snow was waist-deep in places, and each step was a battle. Caleb broke the trail, his larger frame sinking deep, creating a trough for them to follow. He would go for 100 paces, then stop and wait, watching as they pushed forward, their slight bodies struggling against the immense, indifferent landscape. Sue stumbled often, her exhaustion evident in her slower pace, but each time she fell, Leanne was there, a hand extended, a quiet word of encouragement spoken in their native tongue. They never complained. They never asked when it would end. They simply endured, their survival an act of silent, shared will. Caleb found himself looking back more and more often, not just to check their progress, but to draw strength from their tenacity. He had always seen solitude as a form of armor, a way to keep the world's jagged edges from cutting too deep. But watching them, he began to see the flaw in his philosophy. They were two halves of a whole, their bond an invisible shield that protected them from the despair that stalked the frozen wilderness. Their shared existence was a fortress he could only observe from the outside. He was their protector, but in a way he was only beginning to understand, they were also becoming his. As twilight bled purple and orange across the snow-covered peaks, he spotted it in another shelter, this one a trapper's hut nestled in a grove of skeletal aspens. It was more substantial than the last, with a stone chimney and a solid door. Safety, for another night. He pushed on, the promise of its dark, quiet interior pulling them forward, one agonizing step at a time. The trapper's hut was a haven. A small stack of firewood lay beside the stone hearth, a gift from a long-gone occupant. Caleb soon had a fire blazing, its light dancing on the log walls and chasing the deep-seated cold from their bones. The space was larger than the mining cabin, with a crude bunk and a small table. For the first time in days, they felt a sense of fragile domesticity settle over them. Caleb stewed the last of his salted meat with a handful of dried beans, the bubbling pot filling the small hut with a rich, savory aroma. He portioned it out into 3 tin cups, and they ate sitting on the floor around the hearth, the warmth of the fire a comforting presence. The silence that had defined their time together was different now, less a product of fear and more a comfortable quiet. It was Leanne who broke it. "He called us his china dolls," she said, her voice steady but laced with a cold anger. She looked up from her cup, her dark eyes meeting Caleb's. "Mr. Vance. He bought us from a man in San Francisco. Said we were an exotic amusement for his men." Sue flinched at the name, her gaze dropping to the floor. Leanne reached over and placed a hand on her sister's arm, a small, reassuring gesture. "We were seamstresses in our village. Our hands knew silk, not the frozen mud of a railroad track." Caleb listened, his expression unreadable. He had pieced together most of their story from whispers and rumors he'd heard about Vance's camp, but hearing it from her gave it a sharp, painful reality. He had been hunting a man for money, she was describing a monster. "He kept us in his private quarters," Leanne continued, her voice dropping lower. "A cage made of wood and velvet. When we refused him, he cast us out. Told his men we had run. Sent us into the storm to die." Her story hung in the air, as stark and cold as the landscape outside. It was a tale of profound cruelty, met with an even more profound will to live. Sue finally looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She offered Caleb a small, hesitant smile. It was the first genuine expression of warmth he had seen from her, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a flicker of light in the immense darkness of their past, a testament to the hope that refused to be extinguished. He saw them then, not as 2 identical women, but as distinct souls bound by an unbreakable cord, Leanne, the voice and the shield, Sue, the heart and the memory. He found himself wanting to protect not just their bodies, but that fragile, flickering light he saw in Sue's eyes. The bounty on Vance was no longer just a job. It had become a reckoning. The attack came just before dawn, in that liminal hour when the world is a wash of grey and shadows play tricks on the eye. A sharp crack, the splintering of wood, and the hut's door flew inward, torn from its leather hinges. 3 men spilled into the room, their forms silhouetted against the pale, pre-dawn snow. The last one in was Vance, a big man with a face like a slab of raw meat, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Look what the storm blew in," he boomed, his voice filling the small space. "My lost little birds." Leanne and Sue scrambled back, pressing themselves into the darkest corner of the hut, their faces masks of pure terror. Caleb was already moving. He had been sleeping by the fire, his gun belt on, the Colt a familiar weight against his thigh. He rolled behind the stone hearth in a single fluid motion, the first bullet from Vance's men thudding into the log where his head had been a second before. The air exploded with the roar of gunfire, the flashes of light momentarily blinding. Caleb didn't think, he reacted. Years of solitary living, of facing down men worse than this in dusty towns and desolate canyons, had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He fired twice from behind the cover of the hearth. One of the men grunted and collapsed, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The other man spun around, firing wildly into the shadows, his bullets chewing splinters from the walls. Caleb's third shot was precise. The man clutched his throat and fell backward into the snow, his final breath a choked gasp. It was down to Vance. The big man stood in the doorway, his pistol smoking, a look of disbelief on his face. He had expected to find two freezing, helpless women, not a seasoned gunman. "You picked the wrong side, friend," Vance snarled, leveling his weapon. But Caleb was faster. His shot was a deafening crack in the sudden silence. Vance staggered, his pistol falling from his grasp. He looked down at the red blossom on his shirt, then up at Caleb, his eyes wide with a final, mortal surprise. He crumpled to the ground, his body half in and half out of the hut, a final, grim punctuation to their ordeal. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the aspens and the frantic, terrified breathing of Leanne and Sue. Caleb slowly rose from behind the hearth, the smoke from his colt curling in the cold air. The violent, brutal ballet was over. He looked at the bodies, then at the two women huddled in the corner. His right arm throbbed with a searing pain. A stray bullet had grazed his forearm, and blood was soaking through the sleeve of his shirt, a stark crimson against the dark fabric. The aftermath of the violence was a silence deeper than any they had yet known. The world outside was beginning to wake, the sky turning a soft rose, but inside the hut, time had stopped. Caleb stood amidst the carnage, the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder sharp in the air. He felt a familiar hollowness settle in his chest, the cold companion to every life he had taken. He looked at his arm, the torn fabric of his sleeve dark and sticky. The pain was a dull, persistent throb. Leanne and Sue finally moved, emerging from their corner like frightened deer. They saw his wound, and their fear was instantly replaced by a focused concern. Sue rushed outside, returning with a handful of clean snow, while Leanne carefully tore a long strip from the hem of her own cheongsam. They worked together with a silent, practiced efficiency that spoke of a deep, innate understanding of each other. Sue cleaned the wound with the snow, her touch surprisingly gentle, while Leanne bound it tightly with the strip of grey silk. Their heads were bent close together, their dark hair falling forward to create a curtain around their work. In that moment, tending to the injury he had sustained protecting them, the last of the walls between them crumbled. That evening, as the fire burned low, the emotional toll of the day settled upon them. The bodies of Vance and his men had been dragged out into the snow, a grim task that Caleb had performed alone. Now, the three of them sat in the restored quiet of the hut, the shared trauma a tangible thing in the air. Caleb looked at the twins, their faces illuminated by the soft firelight. He saw the shadows under their eyes, the lingering terror, and a wave of something he could only describe as a profound, aching pity washed over him. He had saved them, but he could not erase what they had endured. He had delivered them from one monster only to expose them to another kind of brutality, his own. He felt the need to say something, to offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't form. It was Leanne who spoke, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence with the clarity of a bell. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unwavering, and he could see her sister's identical eyes watching him just over her shoulder. "We want love with you, Caleb," she said, her words simple, yet carrying an impossible weight. Not pity. Sue nodded slowly, her expression solemn, her eyes locking with his. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact, a declaration of a truth so fundamental to them that it needed no explanation. They were not broken things to be pitied. They were women, survivors, and they were offering him the one thing they had left to give, a heart, whole and shared between them. Caleb was rendered speechless. The word lover was foreign territory, a land he had only observed from a great, lonely distance. His life had been a series of transactions, a bounty for gold, a bullet for a threat, a night's shelter for a day's hard ride. The idea of an emotional connection, something given freely without expectation of payment, was as alien as the soft language the sisters whispered to each other. He looked from Leanne's resolute face to Sue's hopeful one. They saw him not as a killer, not as a savior, but as a man. And they were offering him not gratitude, but a home, a place in the unique world they inhabited together. He had no words to answer their quiet declaration, so he answered with action. The next morning, he did not pack his things to leave. Instead, he took his axe and spent the day reinforcing the damaged door and chinking the log walls with mud and moss, sealing them against the lingering winter. He worked in silence, and they worked alongside him. They gathered fallen branches for firewood, their movements a synchronized dance. They found a small spring nearby and brought back fresh water. In the afternoon, while he cleaned his weapons, they took the blood-stained strip of silk from his arm, washed it in the icy spring water, and rebandaged his wound with a clean piece torn from Sue's dress. The days that followed unfolded with a new, gentle rhythm. The hut became less of a shelter and more of a home. A quiet tenderness grew in the spaces between them, nurtured by small, unspoken gestures. He began to learn the subtle differences in their smiles. Leanne's was a rare, slow-blooming thing that touched her eyes first. Sue's was quicker to appear, a bright, hopeful spark that could light up her whole face. He learned that Leanne was the pragmatist, her mind always working on the next step for their survival, while Sue was the dreamer, the one who would pause to watch a hawk circle in the vast blue sky. One evening, Sue hummed a soft, melancholic melody as she stirred a pot of thin rabbit stew. Caleb found himself watching her, captivated by the simple, peaceful domesticity of the scene. Leanne came to sit beside him, her shoulder lightly brushing his. "It is a song from our village," she explained quietly. About the spring thought he said nothing, but he didn't move away. He sat there, between them, the warmth of Leanne's presence on one side and the sweet, sad notes of Sue's song on the other, and felt a thawing in his own frozen soul. It wasn't pity he felt for them anymore. It was something far more profound, something akin to wonder. The first signs of spring began to appear, tentative and fragile. The iron grip of the frost loosened, and the snow began to recede from the south-facing slopes, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The air, though still cold, carried a new scent of wet soil and the promise of life. With the melting snow came the realization that they could not stay in a hut forever. They were in a remote, forgotten corner of the world, but it was not a place to build a life. They needed a community, a place to put down roots. They traveled for another week, moving slowly through the transforming landscape. The journey was different now. It was not a desperate flight from danger, but a steady pilgrimage toward an unknown future. He no longer walked ahead, breaking the trail. He walked with them, sometimes between them, matching his long strides to their smaller ones. He found himself talking more, telling them stories of the towns he'd passed through, of the different landscapes he'd seen, the red rock deserts of the south, the vast, grassy seas of the plains. In return, they told him of their home across the ocean, of a life filled with vibrant colors, bustling markets, and the comforting presence of family. They painted a picture of a world so different from his own, yet their descriptions of loss and hope were universal. One afternoon, they stopped to rest by a newly freed river, its water rushing and churning with melted snow. Sue, ever the first to embrace a moment of beauty, knelt by the bank and dipped her hands in the icy water. She laughed, a sound as clear and bright as the river itself, as she splashed her sister. Leanne, initially protesting, was soon drawn into the playful fight. Caleb sat on a rock and watched them, a genuine smile touching his lips. The sight of their joy, so pure and unrestrained after the darkness they had endured, filled a void in him he hadn't known existed. He realized his hunt for Vance had ended long ago in that bloody dawn at the trapper's hut. What he had been doing since was something else entirely. He had been finding his way home. When they finally saw the town, it was a small collection of buildings nestled in a valley, a thin plume of smoke rising from a blacksmith's forge. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As they stood on the ridge overlooking the settlement, Leanne and Sue moved to stand on either side of him. They didn't take his hands, but their presence was a solid, reassuring weight. He looked at their identical profiles, etched against the backdrop of the valley, and knew he could not leave them. His solitary path had converged with theirs, and their three separate trails had become one. The town was called Redemption. A hopeful name for a place that looked as if it had been carved from the wilderness with grit and stubbornness. The people were wary, their faces weathered by the harsh seasons and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders. They stared at Caleb, a gunslinger with a quiet, dangerous air, and at the two identical Chinese women at his side, their presence an exotic anomaly in this rough-hewn community. But Caleb was done with running, and he was done with being alone. He went not to the saloon, but to the land office. He sold his horse, Dust, the last relic of his old life, for a surprisingly fair price. The act felt like cutting off a limb, but it was a necessary amputation. With the money from the sale and the bounty he quietly claimed on Vance from a federal marshal passing through, he bought a small plot of land a mile outside of town. It was nothing much, 100 acres of rocky soil with a creek running through it and a dilapidated one-room cabin that was barely standing. But it was theirs. He spent the first weeks working from sunrise to sunset, his hands, once accustomed only to the cold steel of a gun, now learning the heft of an axe and the rhythm of a hammer. He repaired the cabin, felling trees and shaping the logs with a determination that puzzled the townsfolk who watched him from a distance. Leanne and Sue worked alongside him, their small hands proving surprisingly strong. They cleared stones from the land where they would plant a garden, hauled water from the creek, and turned the derelict cabin into a clean, warm space. They sealed the walls with a mixture of mud and grass, washed the floors until the wood gleamed, and hung simple cloth curtains over the single window. The town's preacher, a man named Arthur, was the first to approach them. He was an old man with kind eyes who had seen more of human suffering and redemption than most. He came to their homestead one evening, carrying a loaf of freshly baked bread and a jar of preserves. He did not ask about their past. He simply sat with them by their fire, sharing their simple meal and talking about the coming planting season. It was to Arthur that Caleb eventually went. He found him in the small, simple church, polishing the wooden pews. Caleb, a man unaccustomed to asking for anything, found the word sticking in his throat. "We want to be married," he finally managed to say, his voice low. All of us. Arthur stopped his work and looked at him, his gaze thoughtful but not judgmental. He looked out the church window, toward the hill where Caleb's small cabin stood. "The law of man has its limits," the preacher said softly. "And the law of God is concerned with the heart. I see three people who have found a home in each other. That is a holy thing, no matter what shape it takes." The ceremony was not in the church. It was held on their land, at the edge of the creek, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold. There were no guests, only Arthur as their witness. Caleb stood between Leanne and Sue. They wore simple dresses they had sewn themselves from bolts of blue calico bought in town. He took both their hands in his. They did not say vows filled with poetry or promises of forever. They just stood together, their hands linked, a silent testament to the journey that had brought them to this moment. Arthur said a simple prayer, a blessing for their union, for their home, and for the life they would build together. As he finished, a gentle breeze rustled the new leaves on the cottonwood trees. Leanne squeezed Caleb's hand, her touch firm and steady. Sue leaned her head against his shoulder, a quiet gesture of perfect trust. Caleb looked at their faces, so alike and yet so beautifully distinct, and he saw his future. It was not a life of riches or ease, but one of shared burdens and shared joys, a life built on a foundation of love, not pity. The last of the winter snows had finally melted, and the creek ran full and clear, washing the land clean and making way for spring.